I'm very pleased to be honored by this award from the University Torquato di Tella. Through my interaction with colleagues, friends, and students, I have a long-standing attachment to Argentine social science. Okay, I'm particularly pleased to look back at my collaboration with Carlos Nino, whose premature death was a great blow to your country and to the academic community. Later, I collaborated very profitably with, among others, Carlos Acuna, Roberto Gargarello, Gabriel Negretto, and Julia Maskivker. Most recently, the inspector and I have done some joint detective work in tracing the origins of some currently fashionable ideas in social choice theory back to early 20th century Italy and early 19th century France. Although I have not visited Argentina for scholarly purposes for more than 20 years, I am confident that it will not be another 20 years before my next visit. I now turn to my discours de réception. But first let me say that, in a way, I'm sorry that I couldn't improvise a response to these three wonderful presentations. That would have been great fun. But I have prepared a text, and I will read the text instead. But I also want to say to each of you, thank you very much for what you not only kindly but insightfully said about my work. So the topic of my talk is the crisis of the social sciences. And I believe that the social sciences are in a profound state of crisis. And the word I shall use to describe this crisis is obscurantism. I shall also distinguish between hard and soft obscurantism. The second is probably the most familiar. And one can perhaps distinguish 5 main branches of soft obscurantism: Marxism, psychoanalysis, functionalism, various forms of French theory, and most recently the post-colonial and subaltern theories coming out of the Indian subcontinent. They have in common the lack of respect for standards of argument and evidence. They have nothing in common with what has traditionally been thought of as science. And in many countries, these paradigms dominate large parts of anthropology, psychology, sociology, and political science. Many scholars will perhaps accept this rough description of a sad state of affairs. They will add, however, that the discipline of economics provides an outstanding instance of a genuinely scientific approach to social phenomena. I shall contest this claim. In my opinion, economics, as well as its offshoots in political science, offer many examples of what one might call hard obscurantism. While the arguments are coherent and compelling because of their mathematical form, their relevance for understanding social phenomena is often close to nil. 40 years ago, my compatriot Ragnar Frisch, one of the first winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics, said that econometrics must have relevance to concrete realities. Otherwise, it degenerates into something which is not worthy of the name econometrics, but ought rather to be called pleiometrics. The importance of pleiometrics and of science fiction economics more generally has steadily increased since that time. Now, up to a certain point, I'm not against playfulness, but not if it also claims to be science. Soft obscurantists tend to criticize hard obscurantists, and vice versa. So when I criticize both sides, each of them may easily assume that I belong to the other side. Alternatively, each side may take me for an ally in their fight against the other side. Neither situation is particularly pleasant. Fortunately, I have not been alone in this enterprise. A number of public-spirited scholars have taken time off from their own work to criticize and denounce obscurantism in detail, sentence by sentence or equation by equation. They include Chris Aiken, Brian Barry, Robin Dawes, David Freeman, Elizabeth Loftus, Alan Sokol, and of course many others. So in this talk, I shall try to do 3 things. First, I want to document and illustrate the pervasiveness of obscurantism in the social sciences. This will take up the greatest part of the talk. It goes without saying that in a span of 1 hour or less, I cannot go deeply into the theories I shall discuss and criticize. Yet I believe that with one exception, to which I shall return, I could back up my statements with detailed and specific criticism. Second, I shall speculate briefly on the causes of obscurantism. They are, I believe, psychological, sociological, and institutional. Sadly, one of the mechanisms that have been put in place to ensure quality of scientific work, namely citation counts, may in fact serve to entrench obscurantism. And third, I shall discuss how one can do non-obscurantist social science. I have no simple recipe, but I believe that history and psychology will be the key disciplines. Formal quantitative methods have a place, but only when they are sufficiently simple and robust to cast a light on social reality. Now, obscurantism, as I see it, is not only a problem for the social sciences, it is also a problem for society. To put it differently, obscurantism may cause harm as well as waste. To the extent that it causes scholars and students to devote time and other resources to expounding and studying worthless theories, the only effect is waste. But to the extent that obscurantist theories serve as premises for action, they can cause severe harms. So hence we get 4 categories that will organize most of this talk. I'm sorry. The PowerPoint didn't come through correctly. It's roughly speaking correct, but you have to move Badiou from the left-hand bottom side to the right-hand bottom side. Marxism. So something went wrong here. But so these are the 4 categories. That is a 2x2 table, soft and hard, waste and harm. So of course I cannot illustrate or discuss all of these, so I'll have to limit myself to some examples. And I begin with the bottom right-hand corner. Levi-Strauss's early work on kinship systems, although deeply flawed empirically, was not obscurantist. But his later work on analysis of myth seems to me impenetrable and lacking in intersubjective validity. It is closer to numerology or astrology than to science. In France and elsewhere, it was nevertheless deeply influential by holding out the prospect of creating the sociological analog to Mendeleev's periodic table of the elements. But since the heyday of structuralism is over, and the theory seems to have left few traces, I shall not discuss it any further. Functionalism, however, is well and alive, as I discovered upon my recent return to France. While functionalism as a mode of analysis was born in sociology and anthropology, it is, I believe, a very general attitude, rooted, I believe, in our desire, our need to find meaning in the world. To give a flavor of the approach, I can cite the claim that the function of feuds and vendettas is to keep population sizes at a sustainable level. Now, while this may perhaps be an effect of feuding, the term function implies that feuds can be explained by that effect. But this is getting things backwards. Science explains phenomena by their causes, not by their effects. The functionalist ideas of Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu retain an immense and immensely pernicious influence on French social science, and I think also beyond France. According to these writers, various social practices of the most varied kind can be explained by the tendency to maintain the hegemony of dominant groups. And if some practices appear to have a different effect, that fact is itself explicable by, quote, the need of the system to maintain a facade of impartiality. This functionalist mindset is readily identified by the pervasive use of verbs or verbal nouns without subjects, as in the statements I have italicized in this long quote from Foucault's enormously influential Discipline and Punish. So he asks, perhaps one should reverse the problem and ask oneself what is served by the failure of the prison? What is the use of these different phenomena that are continually being criticized? The maintenance of delinquency, the encouragement of recidivism, the transformation of the occasional offender into an habitual delinquent, the organization of a close milieu of delinquency. Perhaps one should look for what is hidden beneath the apparent cynicism of the penal institution, which, after purging the convicts by means of the sentence, continues to follow them by a whole series of brandings. A surveillance that was once de jure and which today is de facto, the police record that has taken the place of the convict's passport, and which thus pursues as a delinquent someone who has acquitted himself of his punishment as an offender. Can we not see a consequence rather than a contradiction? If so, one will be forced to suppose that the prison, and no doubt punishment in general, is not intended to eliminate offences, intended by whom, but rather to distinguish them, to distribute them, to use them. That is not so much that they're in the docile, those are likely to transgress the law, but that they tend to assimilate the transgression of the laws in the general tactics of subjection. Penalty will then appear to be a way of handling illegalities. Who's the handler? Of laying down the limits of tolerance, of giving free rein to some, of putting pressure on others, of excluding a particular section, of making unuseful or neutralizing certain individuals, and of profiting from others. I'm confident, on the basis of serving on French dissertation committees and on intellectual encounters of other kinds, that this general attitude remains pervasive. Currently, the main term of art is that of a dispositif, any kind of institution or behavioral pattern that can be claimed to have the effect or function, directly or indirectly, in the short run or in the long run, or perpetuating the rule of the elites. We can learn from Foucault's onwards how he erected this apparatus, dispositif, into some kind of supra-individual agent. I understand by the term apparatus, that is an English translation for dispositif, a sort of, shall we say, formation, which has as its major function at a given historical moment that they're responding to an urgent need. The apparatus thus has a dominant strategic function. This may have been, for example, the assimilation of a floating population found to be burdensome for an essentially mercantilist economy. There was a strategic imperative acting here as a matrix for an apparatus which gradually undertook the control or subjection of madness, sexual illness, and neurosis. So oppression without oppressors is the, in my opinion, meaningless basis of this approach to society. The functionist Pierre Bourdieu relies in part on his concept of habitus, or disposition to act in a certain way. By and large, the existence of a habitus is proved only by the phenomena it is purported to explain. The appeal to this idea reminds me of Molière's parody of the soft obscurantist of his day. He pictures a candidate for a medical degree being solemnly asked why opium puts people to sleep. And just as solemnly, the candidate replies, because there is in it a dormitive power whose nature is to lull the senses to sleep. The answer is greeted by happy congratulatory chorus. You have responded well indeed. You are most worthy to join our learned brotherhood. Today he would have received a high citation count. Bourdieu's functionalism also relies in part on his tendency to see strategies everywhere. Every behavior that directly or indirectly benefits the agent is presented as a strategic behavior, even in the absence of any evidence that the agent intended his behavior to produce these benefits. Thus, even behavior that is motivated by purely disinterested concern is viewed as strategic, because disinterestedness is often rewarded. So when virtue is rewarded, as happens in many novels, it cannot have been virtuous. It must have been strategic from the beginning. Among the other entries in the bottom right-hand cell of the table, let me briefly mention psychoanalysis. In France and in Argentina, and to a lesser extent in other countries, this approach to the mind is still taken seriously. As a theoretical enterprise, it lacks any scientific foundations. With some important exceptions, the study of psychoanalysis is a waste of time. And this is particularly true of the more extreme representatives such as Jacques Lacan and Melanie Klein. Since I cannot in this short talk offer evidence, let me just cite from a recent editorial in Nature one of the two most prestigious scientific magazines in the world, entitled Psychology, a Reality Check. Anyone reading Sigmund Freud's original work might well be seduced by the beauty of his prose, the elegance of his arguments, and the acuity of his intuition. But those with a grounding in science will be shocked by the abandon with which he elaborates his theories on the basis of essentially no empirical evidence. This is one of the reasons why Freudian-style psychoanalysis has long since fallen out of fashion, and its huge expense, treatment can stretch over years, is not balanced by the evidence of efficacy. So the two phrases I've italicized correspond to my charges of obscurantism and waste. But although psychoanalysis as a form of therapy may have fallen out of fashion in many countries, many scholars still rely on its theoretical framework. I'm not going to dwell on multiculturalism and postmodernism as sources of waste, but simply cite the penetrating criticisms by Brian Barry and Alan Sokol. But let me say a few words about Marxism. I used to belong to the so-called non-bullshit Marxist group, created around 1980, in which we tried out to sort what was living from what was dead in the thought of Karl Marx. We were so successful in the negative task that in the end very little was left. In my own view, the only contribution of Marx that is left standing is his normative conceptions, notably his conception of the good life as one of active and joint self-realization. Marx's theory has nothing to contribute to empirical social science. Yet, in spite of its intellectual bankruptcy, Marxism continues to be taught in universities all over the world in a characteristically obscurantist style of shared verbal reflexes masquerading as arguments. From waste, let me turn to the harm that can be caused by soft obscurantism. In the 1960s and beyond, Bruno Bettelheim persuaded many that the cause of autism lay in uncaring parents, especially in what he called the refrigerator mother. This view, which had no basis in evidence and is today known to be false, caused needless feelings of guilt in parents of autistic children. Similarly, the fact that memories of victims and witnesses can be false or inaccurate even though they believe them to be true has important implications for the legal system and for those who counsel and treat victims of crimes. Some psychotherapists use techniques that are suggestive along the lines of, you don't remember sexual abuse but have the symptoms, so let's just imagine that who might have done it. These can lead patients to false beliefs and memories, causing great damage to the patients themselves and to those who are accused. In one Illinois case, psychiatrist Bennett Brown was accused by his patient Patricia Burgess of using drugs and hypnosis to convince her that she possessed 300 personalities, ate meatloaf made of human flesh, and was the highest priestess in a satanic cult. By some estimates, thousands of people have been harmed in similar ways by well-meaning providers who apply a cure that ends up being worse than the disease. So the perpetrator turns out to be the victim, or the alleged perpetrator. In a Norwegian case, a father was accused of sexual abuse of his daughter. On the basis of her statements, an expert psychologist testified that the sharp fence posts in a child's drawing of a house surrounded by a fence very likely had a sexual significance. She affirmed, moreover, the psychologist, that the number of posts in this fence very probably indicated the number of occasions on which a child had been abused. The child's father spent 2 weeks in jail in a security cell, was barely acquitted of incest, but his life was ruined. Later, the child confessed that it was all an invention. The alleged perpetrator was the victim. It goes without saying that in one sense, Marxism has caused untold harm. Whether Marxism as a theory, rather than a practice, or a rationalization for actions undertaken on other grounds, has done actual harm is not obvious. The Stalinist idea of objective complicity, while consistent with some functionalist aspects of Marxism, probably reflects a very general tendency of the human mind. The more specific idea of crisis maximization, la politique du pire, things have to get worse, to be made worse before they can get better, does perhaps have a more direct Marxist ancestry. But here again, there are many non-Marxist examples. For instance, in 1790, Louis XVI used this strategy. On a more general level, however, Marx's successors took over his intellectual hubris and notably his belief in an historical progression with a desirable, inevitable, and foreseeable outcome. The most serious charge that can be laid against Marx on the score of harm is that his contempt for what he called bourgeois rights probably had a direct influence on the massive human rights violations that his successors carried out. And now we want to discuss what for many will be more controversial or surprising, namely claims about hard, mathematical, quantitative obscurantism. There have been many attempts to explain human behavior using quantitative models. The most prominent ones are perhaps rational choice theory, including game theory, agent-based modeling, and network theory. What little I know about the last two, agent-based modeling and network theory, tends to make me skeptical, but I cannot make any strong claims about them. A long familiarity with rational choice models has, however, fostered a skepticism that is, I hope, better grounded. Before I state the grounds for my skepticism of rational choice theory, let me emphasize that for some purposes it is highly valuable. In my opinion, the development of rational choice theory as a conceptual tool for understanding human action and interaction has been the greatest achievement of the social sciences to date. I'll give some examples later. Rational choice theory is, moreover, an indispensable policy tool for changing behavior, for the simple reason that people tend to respond to incentives in predictable ways. What I deny is that rational choice theory has a privileged status as an explanatory tool. To achieve explanatory success, a theory should minimally satisfy two criteria. It should have determinate implications for behavior, and the implied behavior should in fact be observed. These are necessary conditions, not sufficient ones. Rational choice theory often fails on both counts. The theory may be indeterminate, and people may be irrational. In what was perhaps the first sustained criticism of the theory, John Maynard Keynes emphasized indeterminacy, notably because of the pervasive presence of uncertainty about the behavior of others or about the development of the economy in the long run. In the wake of the current economic crisis after 2007, this objection has returned to the forefront. Before the crisis, going back to the 1970s, the main objection to the theory were based on pervasive irrational behavior. Experimental psychology and behavior economics have uncovered many mechanisms that cause people to deviate from the behavior that rational choice theory prescribes. So, disregarding some technical issues of indeterminacy, the most basic question is embarrassingly simple. How can we impute to the social agents the capacity to make calculations that occupy many pages of mathematical appendices in the leading journals of economics and political science, and that can require only 3 years of professional training? So when I put this embarrassingly simple question to various audiences, their main responses can be classified as follows with my rejoinders. First response: we should accept a theory if it produces correct predictions, even if we don't understand how it does so. And quantum mechanics may be cited as an example. Rejoinder: the social sciences produce very few correct predictions, except for the short-term impact of small changes in economic variables. That is, if you raise the, tax rate 1%, we can say something about the impact on the labor supply in the short run, which is useful, but not exactly grand social science. Second, even though agents are incapable of intentionally maximizing in complex situations, either natural or social selection will eliminate non-maximizers. Rejoinder: this is mere hand-waving. No explicit models exist. Third, individual errors will cancel each other out in the aggregate. Rejoinder: there's no reason to think that errors are symmetrically distributed around the correct answer. And fourth, the famous answer by Milton Friedman: an expert billiard player whose experience helps him figure out the angles will be totally incapable of solving the relevant equations, yet he acts as if he could. That is, as if rationality. Rejoinder: Nobody can be an expert in all the situations in which economists apply rational choice theory. It's been calculated that development of expertise in any field takes about 10,000 hours of practice. Probably expert billiard players invest that much. Now, with regard to irrationality, I'm going to put up on the screen, without reading it, a list of mechanisms that have been shown to generate behavior that violates rational choice theory. This is just a sample. The point about this list is that it's very short compared to the full list of irrationality generating mechanisms. They hardly passes a week unless, when a new mechanism is not posted somewhere on the internet. So, all of these phenomena violate in one way or another the basic axioms of rational choice theory. Now, many scholars, and not just rational choice theorists, find the rapidly expanding array of mechanisms uncomfortably large. Some are also worried about the fact that, unlike rational choice economics, behavioral economics does not rest on a unified theory. Rather, it consists of a bunch of theories or mechanisms that are not deductively linked among themselves or that cannot be deduced from a single overarching theory. Human behavior seems to be guided by a number of unrelated quirks rather than by consistent maximization of utility. In fact, there are so many quirks that it seems that for any observed behavior, there will be a quirk that fits it. While these qualms are understandable, they do not, in my opinion, amount to reasoned criticism. Behavioral economics is here to stay. Now, as I said, I think I know something about rational choice theory and its alternatives. I cannot myself prove theorems, but I can understand the proofs if they're not too complicated. With regard to data analysis, that is statistical analysis of explanations, regression equations basically explaining social phenomena, I cannot make any claims to first-hand competence. I rely mainly on the work of David Friedman, an acknowledged master of pure and applied statistics. He carried, for instance, out detailed analysis of 6 articles published in leading academic journals, 4 articles from American Political Science Review, 1 from Quarterly Journal of Economics, and 1 from American Sociological Review. One of these articles was named Best Article of the Year by the journal where it appeared. Yet the number of mistakes and confusion that Friedman finds, some of them so elementary that even I can understand them, is staggering. Friedman demonstrated the many pitfalls, fallacies, and temptations that arise in regression analysis as it is routinely carried out. He also observed that social scientists fail to take an elementary precaution that will reduce the risk of data mining and curve fitting. They could put half of their data in cold storage, as it were, estimate the model against the other half, and then see how well the estimated model fits the data in cold storage. Whereas this procedure is routine in medical and social and biological studies, it is not recommended in social science textbooks, nor required by social science journals. And it seems to me that the neglect of an existing cure for bias itself amounts to a form of bias, or perhaps worse. So let me cite 2 of my favorite among Friedman's statements. The first is taken from a famous article he wrote called Statistical Models and Shoe Leather. He says, a crude 4-point scale may be useful. First, regression usually works, although it is, like anything else, imperfect and may sometimes go wrong. Second, regression sometimes works in the hands of skillful practitioners, but it isn't suitable for routine use. 3, regression might work, but it hasn't yet. 4, regression can't work. Textbooks, courtroom testimony, and newspaper interviews seem to put regression into category 1. Category 4 seems too pessimistic. My own view, says Friedman, is practically by categories 2 and 3, although good examples are hard to find. Now, when I presented my objection to data analysis to various audiences, the critics have usually, or almost invariably, located themselves at point 1 of this scale. The second statement I shall cite offers a caricature, which like any good caricature reveals important features of its object, or the responses that modelers might make, and in fact often have made, to his criticism. And I think I'll read them, because it's really a wonderful list. We know all that. Nothing is perfect. Linearity has to be a good first approximation. Log linearity has to be a good first approximation. The assumptions are reasonable. The assumptions don't matter. The assumptions are conservative. You can't prove the assumptions are wrong. The biases will cancel. We can model the biases. We're only doing what everybody else does. Now we use more sophisticated techniques. If we don't do it, someone else will. What would you do? The decision maker has to be better off with us than without us. We all have mental models. Not using a model is still a model. The models aren't totally useless. You have to do the best you can with the data. You have to make assumptions in order to make progress. You have to give models the benefit of the doubt. Where is the harm? And I suppose, I bet that those of you who do data analysis have heard and sometimes perhaps made these statements. One of these statements, I'm pretty sure. Now I'll return to the question of harm. First, there's the question of waste. I believe that much work in economics and political science that is inspired by rational choice theory is devoid of any explanatory, aesthetic, or mathematical interest, which means that it has no value at all. I cannot make a quantitative assessment of the proportion of work in leading journals that fall in this category, but I'm confident that it does represent waste on a staggering scale. And I believe, but less confidently, that the same is true of many instances of data analysis. The amount of harm caused by hard obscurantism is more difficult to assess. I don't know any detailed study discussing the importance of modular hubris in the 1998 collapse of long-term capital management, costing investors $4.5 billion, or in the current financial crisis. You may remember that two of the leading managers of long-term capital management had received the Nobel Prize in Economics some years just before the crisis. Now, so I don't know, but it's possible that greed, short-termism, and deregulation may have been more important than unwarranted confidence in the Nobel Prize winning models. Although one can cite many examples of fund managers telling their clients that according to their models, a crisis of the magnitude of what has happened since 2007 would only occur once in n years, n being some very large number, it remains to be shown that these managers actually believed in the models and used them as decision premises. After all, as we have learned, they had very little to lose if the models got it wrong. Their situation was basically heads I win, tails you lose. This being said, I find it hard to believe that excessive belief in the efficiency of markets and rationality of market participants did not play some role in generating the crisis. Since the information that is reflected in prices is a public good, nobody has an incentive to produce it. This free rider problem generates mechanical diversification of assets as a substitute for due diligence. The Warren Buffett remedy, similar to the shoe leather sociology that David Friedman proposed to keep data analysis honest, is shoe leather investment. Turning now to the possible harm caused by data analysis, let's consider the impact of Chicago-style economics on legislation concerning the death penalty and gun control. In one summary, in 1975, Isaac Ehrlich's analysis of national time series data led him to claim that each execution saved 8 lives. Solicitor General Robert Bork cited Ehrlich's work to the Supreme Court a year later, and the court, while claiming not to have relied on empirical evidence, ended the death penalty moratorium when it upheld various capital punishment statutes in Gregg versus Georgia and related cases. Although Ehrlich's work was discredited, a new wave of studies claimed to have found similar effects. Commenting on an analysis that challenged those findings, Ehrlich said to the New York Times that if variations like unemployment, income inequality, likelihood of apprehension and willingness to use the death penalty are accounted for, the death penalty shows a significant deterring effect. In sobering contrast, Chris Aiken warns that a statistical specification with more than 3 explanatory variables is meaningless. There are just too many ways to fiddle with the numbers. Similar remarks apply to a claim by John Lott, cited by John Ashcroft when he was Attorney General in the Bush administration, that the right to carry concealed handguns saves lives. In one comment on this work, a scholar writes that the academic survival of a flawed study may not be of much consequence, but unfortunately the ill effects of a bad policy influenced by flawed research may hurt generations. In other words, whereas we can tolerate waste, we should not accept harm. The advocates of death penalty and right to carry laws will respond that these measures tend to reduce harm. In a discussion of life trade-offs, Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule defend the death penalty on these grounds. To be sure, they qualify their argument as a conditional one, valid only if the empirical claims stand up. Yet, in my opinion, they display considerable hubris when, as legal scholars with no econometric training, they assert that one leading study finds that as a national average, each execution deters some 18 murders, and proceed to discuss the implications. If they had read David Friedman, they would have understood that the idea of executing people on the basis of any kind of statistical analysis is morally unacceptable. There's just too much uncertainty about the facts to warrant this irreversible action. So if you're willing to grant me provisionally at least the claim that soft and hard obscurities are sufficiently widespread to justify worry, you may have asked yourself about their causes. And as I said at the outset, the causes may be psychological, sociological, or institutional. At a psychological level, hard obscurities may be due to the widespread belief that social science can or must become a science on the model of the natural sciences. While talk about physics envy may be too strong, there may be an unconscious desire to emulate the most prestigious scientific disciplines. The highly sophisticated theories hold out the promise of satisfying this desire. At the more mundane level, the high prestige of mathematical social science goes together with very high salaries. A young scholar with a talent for mathematics may easily be lured by the prospect of rising to the top of the profession. At the same time, the normal workings of self-deception may prevent him from understanding that he is weaving a web of froth. And finally, self-selection may cause recruitment into these professions to be biased in favor of scholars who are subject to the relevant forms of hypertrophy and atrophy to begin with. To understand the psychological roots of soft obscurantism, I suggest that we turn to the phenomenology of scholarship. When we believe that we have found the cause of a phenomenon, there occurs some kind of mental click of satisfaction. Other mental operations also trigger clicks. There's a click of observing a similarity between a phenomenon and another one. The click of observing that a phenomenon has consequences that benefit someone or something. And the click of observing that some other phenomenon could have been a cause of the phenomenon we are studying. Because all these observations satisfy our deep-seated need to find order, patterns, and meanings in the universe that trigger a click that is easily mistaken for the real thing, which is the click of explanation. I offer this not as an established truth, but as a hypothesis that might explain the grip that analogies, functional explanations, and just so stories have on the mind. And these attempted shortcuts to knowledge also have a great deal of their attraction to our unwillingness to admit ignorance. As Montaigne said, many of this world's abuses are engendered, or to put it more rashly, all of this world's abuses are engendered by our being schooled to be afraid to admit our ignorance, and because we are required to accept anything which we cannot refute. Although these explanatory suggestions at the individual level may in a given case have some force, they lack perhaps the necessary sociological dimension. The persistence over time of pseudoscience at a large scale is a collective phenomenon which must be sustained by mechanisms of social interaction. And I'll discuss two possible mechanisms, mind-binding and pluralistic ignorance. The idea of mind-binding draws on the practice of foot-binding of Chinese women. Although crippling and horribly painful, foot-binding persisted as a bad equilibrium because, given that no parents would let their son marry a woman who did not have her feet bound, it was the interest of the parents of girls to adhere to this practice. No family had an incentive to deviate unilaterally. Yet the practice stopped between roughly 1899 and 1919, I think, by successful collective action. Because people came to perceive that the practice made everybody worse off than they could be, groups of parents came together to pledge in public that they would not bind the feet of their daughters nor marry their sons to women whose feet were bound. So my suggestion is just that, is that mind binding perpetuates hard obscurantism because departments have to train their students in abstruse mathematical techniques. If they don't, the students won't get jobs in elite departments, just as Chinese women without their feet bound could not get married. Mind binding differs from foot binding, however, in an important respect. Even before foot binding was abolished, it was widely perceived as absurd and perverse, a perception that eventually led to its demise. By contrast, most chairs of departments of economics and political science probably do not perceive themselves as being in a bad equilibrium. To the extent that the individual scholars are seized with occasional doubts, as being human, they can hardly fail to be, and look at what their colleagues are doing may assuage their worries, or at least prevent them from speaking up. And these remarks brings me to the second interaction-based mechanism, pluralistic ignorance. This idea dates from 1835, when Hans Christian Andersen published his tale about the emperor's new clothes. It was given a more theoretical formulation 5 years later in the second volume of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and then rediscovered by psychologists in the early 19th century. In an extreme case, pluralistic ignorance obtains when no member of a community believes a certain proposition or espouses a certain value, but each believes that everybody else holds the belief or the value. And in a more common case, it obtains when only a few members hold the belief or the value in question, but most of them believe that most others do. In the case of economic and statistical models, pluralistic ignorance will obtain if each scholar, although secretly worried about the fragility or relevance of the procedures, kept quiet because of the perception that his colleagues are firmly convinced of their validity. And there are several mechanisms that might be at work here. From my own experience, I know very well how a scholar's, that is my, confidence in his own judgment can be undermined by the fact that the majority thinks differently. How could all these people, who are certainly smarter than I am, be so wrong? Also, even with unshakable self-confidence, a scholar might worry that speaking up might cause ostracism or career obstacles. Now, finally, hard and soft obscurantism will be hard to eradicate because of recent institutional developments. Today, as I said at the outset, the scientific community increasingly seeks to base tenure decisions and funding decisions on quantitative criteria, notably on citation counts. To the extent that these criteria are used together with qualitative criteria, which are based on some competent evaluators actually reading literature, this development may not be a bad thing. But I think there's a real danger today, and many of my colleagues think so too, that high citation numbers are turning into sufficient, not merely necessary, criterion for excellence. And since hard obscurantists tend to cite other hard obscurantists, and soft obscurantists tend to cite other soft obscurantists, and since there are plenty of scholars in each camp, they can perpetuate themselves as a group by citing each other. Now, I find that high citation counts of soft obscurantists are especially striking. If you look at the number of citations on Google Scholar, you find the following numbers. These are rough numbers, because different search engines, in fact, give different results. So, but the order of magnitude is more or less correct. So the first five are soft obscurantists. You see, I counted Bourdieu and Foucault twice because I wanted also to show the importance of this pseudo-concept of habitus and dispositif. The last five are not obscurantists at all, but represent what I believe to be the best or among the best scholars in respectively psychology, economics, political science, sociology, and anthropology of the last half century. And as you can see, not even the best serious scholars can compete with even a marginal soft obscurantist, like Homi Bhabha. By citing the last 5 names, I proposed an implicit definition of non-obscurantist social science. An explicit definition is hard to give. I could simply say that good social science respects facts, logic, and common sense. But I shall try to go beyond that trite statement by offering some examples of simple, robust causal mechanisms of the kind that we would expect to find in non-obscurantist social science. I, in fact, already cited 2 examples, the idea of a bad equilibrium and that of pluralistic ignorance. And I'm going to spend a little time on a 3rd example, taken from Tocqueville's Democracy in America. He first writes that our fathers had a peculiar opinion of marriage, having observed that what few marriages of inclination, that is, love marriages, were made in their time, always ended badly. There is a word missing. Always ended badly. They resolutely concluded that it was very dangerous to consult one's own heart in such matters. Chance struck them as more clairvoyant than choice. That is, arranged marriages were more likely to be successful than love marriages. He then goes on to show why this conclusion was unjustified. Because suppose that in an aristocratic society, 2 young people marry for love. By going against the current, they will tend to encounter the hostility of their friends and relatives, a situation that, as Tocqueville says, soon breaks their courage and embitters their hearts. But in a society where this practice of marrying for love was general, this effect would not arise. Tocqueville also points to another mechanism that explains why we cannot generalize from exceptional cases to the general case. For a man to marry for love in societies in which this practice is uncommon, he must have, in Tocqueville's words, a certain violence, an adventurous cast of mind, and people of this character, no matter what direction they take, rarely arrive at happiness or virtue. And one might add that the marriage of 2 people of this disposition is even less likely to be happy. Now, for me, this argument is a model about how to think about society. A further example is provided by an analysis of the puzzling fact that people sometimes burn their bridges or their boats. It would seem that no rational individual would ever throw away a resource, a bridge or a boat, that might prove useful. Any such behavior must be irrational, caused by panic, perhaps. Yet Thomas Schelling showed that it can make perfect sense. So suppose that... Oh, I had a PDF here, which disappeared. Okay, so I'll have to explain it verbally. Suppose that there's a conflict between 2 countries, country 1 and country 2, over a contested piece of territory. And country 1 debates whether to invade, to attack, or to negotiate. If country 1 attacks, country 2 has a choice between fighting and retreating. So the payoffs are as follows. If country 1 negotiates, each country gets 3, a reward of 3. Higher rewards, higher numbers, higher, better. If country 1 attacks and country 2 fights, both countries will get 1. If country 1 attacks and country 2 retreats, country 1 will get 4 and country 2 will get 2. So it's obviously in the interest of country 1 to attack, because country 1 can anticipate that if it does so, country 2 will retreat, get a better payoff than a fight payoff, and therefore attack is rational. However, assume that the general of country 2 can burn his bridges or his boats, making himself unable to retreat, so that if attacked he will have to fight. Then the outcome is that both countries get a payoff of 1, which is worse than a negotiated outcome. Therefore, in that case, the general country 1 will rationally decide to negotiate rather than to attack. So Schelling showed, in other words, how less is more sometimes. One can improve one's outcome by throwing away some of its resources, burning one's boats, burning one's bridges. This is also, I think, the model of social science analysis. So the analysis of bad equilibria and of the rationality of burning one's bridges rely on game theory, one of the most powerful tools of the social sciences. It is the perfect tool, in fact, for understanding the conceptual structure of human interaction. It can help us understand why people sometimes do not cooperate, even when it is in their objective interest to do so, and why in other situations they do manage to cooperate. But game theory is useful, however, only to the extent that it doesn't impute excessive cognitive abilities to the social agents. When it does so, it ceases to be social science and turns into science fiction or hard obscurantism. Thomas Schelling once told me that before he wrote his path-breaking work, The Strategy of Conflict, he spent a year or two reading randomly in military history. I believe, in fact, that history should be one of the two unifying disciplines in the social sciences. By virtue of their knowledge, good historians can pick out a telling detail as well as a robust anomaly, thus providing both stimulus and reality check for theorists. And the other unifying discipline is what you might call the science of choice. Today, the study of choice is divided among psychology, microeconomics, and behavioral economics. In the future, I believe this will fuse into a single discipline, relying on laboratory experiments as well as on field studies. So if I'm right, my conclusions also have obvious implications for graduate training in the social sciences. Today, students of sociology have to read Durkheim, Marx, and Weber. Students of economics read Adam Smith and Ricardo. Students of political science read Aristotle, Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau. Without denying that these readings can be useful, I find it scandalous that students are not also required to read works in social history, economic history, and political history. At the same time, they should learn how to do laboratory experiments and field experiments to test the theories. Now, some students could, to be sure, be left to pursue the abstract mathematical models. Attempts to understand the actions and interactions of ideally irrational agents who have never existed and never will exist can have a certain aesthetic value. They may even, on occasion, have some mathematical value. As long as nobody pretends that the models have an explanatory value, they will not be privileged in the curriculum or in the reward system as they are today. So in conclusion, I have to confess to some skepticism about whether my arguments will have an impact. Soft obscurantists are not interested in arguments. The only way to affect them is to make them shoot themselves in the foot, as Alan Sokol did in his famous hoax. But as the obscurantists are now forewarned, this is unlikely to happen again. As for hard obscurantism, the guild of economists and high-tech political scientists form an almost impregnable bastion of highly skilled professionals who do not believe in anyone's credentials but their own. They will not listen to outsider criticism, like mine, for instance. And though insider critics are now somewhat more common than they were 30 years ago, they usually, in my opinion, share too many assumptions with the hard obscurantists. So while I'm afraid that obscurantism is here to stay, I do not think it will come to dominate the social sciences completely, because I have great faith in the invincible curiosity of the human mind. Thank you.
Bueno, damos finalización a esta ceremonia, no sin antes agradecer a todos los presentes por estar con nosotros y fundamentalmente al doctor John Elster, que a partir de hoy es miembro de nuestra comunidad italiana. Así que a todos muchas gracias y nos estamos viendo. Hasta luego.